God bless everybody today. It's April 18th, 2026. I wanted to do a video on Nostradamus and how possibly his predictions led us to a possible Antichrist in 2026. And so if you look at his quatrains that he had given us to an end-day Antichrist, I believe that there is a lot of connections that lead us to where we are today. He had, based on history and scholars in the past, he supposedly had predicted two original antichrists in the time of human history, and then we would see a third antichrist at the very end of time. Hitler, which was pictured here next to Nostradamus, was the second antichrist in his predictions. And the first Antichrist that he had predicted was Napoleon. So the question is, and I've been wondering, as many scholars have for years, and just people in general, whether Nostradamus had a insight into the future. This man lived in the 1600s, and how that might affect us as we move forward into this year of 2026, when possibly he predicted we would see a third Antichrist come about and be on this planet. So this is probably going to be a little longer video, but if you actually get into Nostradamus or end time predictions in any shape or form, you're going to probably find some pertinent and interesting information that I'm going to provide that actually sort of links us to what I've been talking about in my videos for the last 8 years, where we are today, and how the paradigm 2030 date stamps seem to also add up to a particular time, which is right now April of 2026. Very specific date pops out as we move through this text file that you're going to realize ends up on April 20th of 2026, which was actually Hitler's birthday, or his birth date. So let's look at this. It's a pretty deep dive. There's about 6 quatrains overall that we're going to look at that bring a lot of light to believe what is actually happening to us at this very moment in time. So the first thing I want to state is that I don't know if there's any relevance here at all. I don't know whether this is going to come true. I'm just showing you the connections based on my analysis and how I've looked at these for at least 2 decades, and I believe that a lot of this stuff is lining up now. We are also not going to look at the 2 first antichrists that Nostradamus predicted, because there's a lot of videos and theories out there from a number of scholars in the past that seem to link the 2 antichrists, Napoleon and Hitler, to the first and second Antichrist. We are looking at possibly this third Antichrist, and whether Nostradamus had the ability to see into the future, into our time now, and whether that was going to affect us as we move forward. And I believe there is a lot of information here that does pertain to us as we move forward today. As always, I try to produce a text file so that it's easy for you to follow and read through, and also keeps me on topic so that I'm not wandering, because I'll say something and then my mind will go to some other area and I realize that I'm off script. So I think this really helps us, or at least helps me provide the information to you. So when I was breaking this down, I was actually pretty amazed how possibly accurate he was, and how he leads to a very specific date of about 2026 based on his quatrains. And he actually gives us a very specific date of the 7th month of 1999, and how a possible event at that time in our history affected and compelled a leader to where he is now, that's actually getting ready to break out in the Middle East, and that would be Erdogan of Turkey. So did Nostradamus predict an Antichrist rise around the year 2026, which is the year we are in today? And that if you know about the Bible, that he would reign for 3.5 years between around 2026 and 2029 based on a number of his quatrains and dates that he's built in, or the time zones that he's given us in these quatrains, that we should be looking at possibly today for a third Antichrist coming out of Turkey, which would be Erdogan. Nostradamus is widely believed to have prophesied the rise of 3 Antichrists. I talked about this. He's going to go into some pretty extreme detail here. These individuals who would cause massive global destruction and war, while he never explicitly used the term Antichrist as a modern title for these specific figures, he describes them as enemies of God or great kings of terror who would bring about widespread bloodshed. I say we're not going to go into the first 2 Antichrists because there's a lot of literature out there that you can go look into, and it's extremely interesting to look at and how he possibly predicted these 2 leaders. Now, some of the quatrains will sort of allude to this as we move forward, but like I say, we're going to concentrate on this third possible pending Antichrist as we move forward. So the first Antichrist that he predicted was Napoleon. And this is often linked to the quatrains describing a pauper from France who would conquer much of Europe and bring death to many. Nostradamus had predicted the second Antichrist in time, and there have been many Antichrists. There's, the Stalins of the world and things like that, but he predicted 2 of these to be a time of great distress, and he also thought that in this transition from the first Antichrist to the third Antichrist, each of these would get progressively worse. And so you would see Napoleon would be a terrible leader that would affect millions, but by the time you got to Adolf Hitler, it would amplify tremendously and get much worse. And then by the third Antichrist, it would be worse than either of these 2 prior, and the worst time in history of mankind. It also indicates in the quatrains as we move forward that he talks about how he predicted a global war that would last 27 years. And actually there's a very specific date stamp in 1999 that leads us to possibly believe that 2026 is when you would possibly see this third Antichrist. Now he refers to this third Antichrist as you move forward in the quatrains. In quatrain 262, he refers to him as Mobus. And we will go into some of this terminology and different things like that, because I think it's important that we sort of break this completely down. Each of his quatrains, as you will see in these 4 quatrains that we're going to look at first, most of them are broken down into 4 parts. Not all of them, but most of them are broken down into 4 parts. And so we're going to take each of these components individually, look at them and how that might affect us today, or at least in general how that quatrain could affect us in 2026 as we move forward into this April 20th, 2026 date. So I had indicated he's got about 6 quatrains that we're going to look at. There's 4 that we're going to concentrate originally on that really go into where we are today, and then there's 2 additional ones that I think link us to this leader of today that will possibly turn into an Antichrist based on a number of prophecies like Daniel 8, Ezekiel 38, 39, Ezekiel 26, Jeremiah 49. There's a whole bunch of them. Get into Revelation, different things like that. So you can see that each of the quatrains has sort of a prophecy attached to it. The Mobus prophecy, the 27-year war, the reborn Hannibal, which we'll look at who this might be, and the King of Terror, and how these date stamps of like the 27-year war might affect us now, and this possible year of 1999 in the 7th month, and how actually there was an event in 1999 in July that could have really compelled a leader to where he is now, and that will affect us as we move forward, as you're watching the Middle East break down, and Turkey, Erdogan literally threatening Israel with a possible invasion due to their expansion to Lebanon and Gaza, as well as their combinational attacks on Iran with the United States. So like I said, we're going to look at these 4 quatrains. We're going to take them individually as we move forward, and I believe that you're going to see a lot of similarities to where we are today. And like I say, a lot of this is speculation, opinion, whether or not it will actually come true. We're going to find out in the next few days whether Nostradamus had anything in his predictions that would actually lead us to where we are now between 2026 and 2029. And I believe there is a lot here that he had brought to the table that we should address. And so let's look at these individually, and we'll do a deep dive into each and every one of them, because each of these components that he added to the quatrain seem to matter to what is happening at this moment in time. Now, because the quatrains are cryptic and written in a mix of Middle French, Greek, Latin, Italian, modern candidates for the third Antichrist are frequently updated based on current events, past and present candidates, and a lot of people have been included in this potential Antichrist. A lot of Middle East leaders have been looked at as this possible Nostradamus third Antichrist, like Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, different things like that, because as you're going to go into the other quatrains we look at later in this study, it talks about this blue turban and how he comes out of Greater Arabia, which could possibly be the Arabian areas, or if you break it down in the quatrain, Western Asia, which possibly could include Turkey, and a lot of scholars believe that's where he comes from based on the terminology in the quatrains that he actually is using. Modern day superpower leaders have also been brought into this equation. A lot of them have been discounted, like Vladimir Putin or even Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not the Antichrist. If you go into biblical understanding, you'll realize he comes from the Middle East. He's a Muslim Antichrist figure that will bring a caliphate against the Jews and Christians to try to either convert them or bring them into a beast system or a Sharia law type system. And so Donald Trump just doesn't fit. Now, does it look bad with all the calamity out here now and what's going on in the Middle East, and how he's trying to, in his way, stop potentially a nuclear Iran from destroying a country called Israel, or even threatening, the globe overall? That's something to be looked at. But these modern day leaders, like the Russian leader Vladimir Putin, is not the Antichrist. A lot of people believe that if you look at Rosh in Ezekiel 38, that leads you to believe that it's Russia. And if you look at the terminology Rosh and you look at the Hebrew, you'll realize that's just the leader or the head of that country. If you go into what I've been talking about, at least for the last decade, just in videos, I've alluded to this being Erdogan of Turkey for some time. So we have all these different potentials, you know, even Osama bin Laden, if you move his initials around, might possibly have come up with this, but all these leaders have passed. So like Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, all these guys are dead or gone, and they're not the third Antichrist. We know that now that we've seen history and how we've seen their demise. In my opinion, all four quatrains reflect our time now, and that they'll reflect or radiate into this year of 2026 to 2029. It also fits directly into my Paradigm 2030 chart, which has nothing to do with what we're going to show you here. But it's amazing that we both ended up in the same place. I believe these connections bring us to a global leader today that is threatening Israel today. When I put this together, it was April 16, 2026, with an attack or even a possible invasion of the Middle East that would encompass about a quarter of the world by the time he's done, as we move forward. If you go into Revelation and the six seals, you'll realize that those first four horsemen consume approximately a quarter of the planet. So let's look at each of these four quatrains individually and in the order Nostradamus states the events, and we'll see what we find out and how this possibly could occur. That 2026 would be the entrance of a third Antichrist in his possible quatrains as we move forward. So when we look at this first quatrain, I'm amazed how Nostradamus, best known for this prophetic book he published in 1555, and this had 942 prophetic quatrains allegedly seeming to predict future events even into possibly 2026. They're extremely accurate, and so that's why I wanted to address these, because it does seem to be affecting us at this very moment in time. So it gives you these four quatrains. We're going to look at each of them individually. They're mostly broken down into four different segments, and each of them addresses a very specific time or event. The first one is Century 2, Quatrain 62, the Mobus Prophecy. It states that Mobus will die, then will come. So if you think about now, and we're going to get into this more detail, I've talked about how if you look at Isaiah 14, Daniel 8, Ezekiel 38, you're going to see that this leader Gog of Ezekiel 38-39, which actually is, in my opinion, the first seal or white horseman of Revelation that brings a quarter of the world into war, will die on a sixth seal during the wrath of the Lamb in Revelation 6:16. He is sort of alluding to a similar process here, because Mobus will die and then he will come and then he will bring horrible undoings to people and animals. At once one will see vengeance, 100 powers, thirst, famine, and a comet will pass. So he's talking about the seals, how we're going through a massive global destruction, in the sense that there's food shortages, fuel shortages, things like that we're starting to see processed through the world right now, and how this is affecting you, especially into the fourth seal. Then he talks about how we would see this comet go through at this very moment in time, and in reality we do have a comet going through, actually two comets going through at this moment in time that affect us between April 20th and approximately April 27th, I believe. High visibility point is approximately around that date of April 20th of 2026, and so this is extremely important that maybe Nostradamus had extreme insight in his profound prophecies and how they are going to affect us. So the first thing he states is Mobus will soon die, then he will come. So whoever this leader is will die. talked about he'll be a resurrected Antichrist. He's not just a man. Look, if you go into Revelation, into a number, especially Isaiah 14, it talks about how the star will fall from heaven, get a key to a bottomless pit, open up the abyss, bring forth an Antichrist that he controls. It's not Satan himself. He controls Antichrist and the false prophet. So when you look at this prophecy of Daniel 8, verse 6 through 9, it talks about how this he-goat attacks this two-horned ram. Now the he-goat, as we move forward in this prophecy, would be Turkey, and the two-horned ram would be Medo-Persia, and those would be the Kurds in Iran. And so all those players right now are being affected in the Middle East. He sees this ram standing by the river, and this goat runs onto him with power and basically destroys him. He smotes the ram, he breaks his two horns. The ram has no potential power to stand against this he-goat with the large one single horn. He is cast to the ground, stomped upon, and no one could deliver this ram out of his hand. Like I state, if you go into the history of the Bible, we believe this is Medo-Persia, which would be the Kurds in Iran. And if you look at the Daniel 8 prophecy, which I believe is taking effect right now, and I've talked about this in my last video, we're watching those Kurds literally being shoved out of Turkey, Syria, into Iraq, east of the Euphrates at this point, and they're starting to collapse into Iran. If you look at the western border of Iran, especially the northern portion of Iran, the northwest portion along the border of Turkey, those are all Kurdistan nations. And if you look at Turkey and their genocide against the Kurds, this has been occurring since approximately 1984. So he destroys this ram, but then also, if you go into verse 8, it talks about how this goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, he is also broken or killed. Maybe possibly the leader of Turkey would be destroyed at this moment in time. That's Erdogan, so we'll have to watch him as he's literally threatening Israel with a possible invasion, as Israel is starting to expand into Lebanon, especially at this time. And the ceasefire also fell apart originally in the last week or two because Lebanon was not added into this, because Hezbollah is part of a group that's supported by Iran, and they want to remove Hezbollah out of Lebanon. And so it's interesting that once this goat horn is broken and this goat is possibly killed, this leader is dead and buried, then we see a possible Antichrist rise from this potential demise of this leader. It also gives you a demarcation here, because it talks about, for it came up notable ones towards the four winds of heaven. So I've talked about this many times. If you go into the four winds of heaven, the four winds of heaven are held back on the seventh seal in Revelation 7:1 and are released on the sixth seal when Antichrist appears in Revelation 9:13. And then right after, you have the demise of this goat. It talks about out of one of these areas we would see a little horn called Antichrist come forward. It talks, interestingly, that he would go south and towards the east and towards the pleasant land. So whatever this country is would be north of Israel, and we're not talking Russia at this time. Now this takes me to my theory that I believe that the first seal of Revelation matters to where we are going in this discussion as we move forward. So what I've been talking about in the last 8 9 years in my videos is a new concept that I've never really seen before at this point. Please let me know if you see anyone with a similar teaching that I'm going to show you here as we move down in through this text file. I have been discussing this for a long time. I've been making videos for almost 8-9 years about this. My narrative has not changed. It's basically been the same narrative since my original video. If you go back and look at that, that pertains now to today. Please be open-minded to this new concept as I explain it completely. I believe it will make sense once you see it. And this is my understanding, and you may not agree with any part of it, but I believe I can bring some interesting ideas of what possibly Nostradamus was alluding to in his quatrains. Since my first video over 8 years ago, I've been talking about how I believe, in my opinion, Erdogan of Turkey will consume the whole Middle East, bringing a quarter of the earth into war, especially stated in Revelation 6 verse 8, in a sixth seal war prior to the entrance of an Antichrist on the sixth trumpet. If you look at the chronological order of the 22 chapters of Revelation and you cut out the 3 visions that John has while he's in heaven, chapter 7 of the elect, chapter 11 through 14 of the nations and people, and chapter 17 through 19 of Mystery Babylon. If you remove those chapters, it's a chronological book, so you would read it chapter 1 through 6, 8 through 10, 15, 16, and 20 through 22. It gives you a chronological complete story of Revelation, and then you can layer in the additional visions that John has about the elect, nations and people, and Mystery Babylon, which is basically 8 chapters long in total. So most of the scholars today, or throughout time, have 3 theories on who the white horsemen of Revelation are. It's either Jesus, it's Antichrist, or it's a history lesson of seals that occur throughout time that bring us into an end-day Antichrist period of time or phase. I believe that, in my opinion, based on my study and analysis, is that Erdogan is the white horseman or first seal of Revelation, that he will consume approximately a quarter of the earth. He will bring 10 nations of Ezekiel 38 and 39 against Israel, and we will see those 10 nations destroyed on a 6 seal event. Once the Medo-Persians align, and so you're going to see the Kurds forced through Turkey to align with Iran, Persia. Turkey would destroy both these nations once this alignment occurs. Once Iran is consumed into this 10-nation alliance and falls as a nation, that would then complete Daniel 8, bringing up the battle of Ezekiel 38-39, because what you would see is those 10 nations would align, and then they would actually go against Israel and then be destroyed on a 6 seal event through the wrath of the Son, or Jesus, in Revelation 6:16. There is a difference between Revelation 6:16 and the wrath of Jesus or the Lamb, and the wrath of God in Revelation 15:1, which starts the 7-bowl phase. So I've talked about how Erdogan, after attacking and destroying Iran, would then also be destroyed himself. He would be buried in possibly a tomb. There is a very specific tomb that seems to come to mind. This is the tomb of Suleiman Shah. It's a Turkish-owned tomb, actually in Syria. This is where the first sultan is buried. Erdogan believes that he wants to be the new Ottoman Empire for the next 100 years of his legacy. And so he would be his own sultan. And he is the leader, basically, of the overall Muslim community. In general, they look to him for guidance due to his military and different things like that. So you could see Erdogan die. He'd be buried in the tomb, as it indicates in the prophecy above. Mobus would die, and then he would come. He would bring a horrible undoing unto people and animals. Once he will see vengeance because he died in this process, and come back as an Antichrist, bringing all kinds of hunger, famine, thirst, seals with him, if you think of the second through the fourth seal. And then he talks about how this comet would pass also. So it's interesting that he brought all these things to the table, and possibly this leader would die. I'm speculating that he would, because he's considered the new sultan of the new Ottoman Empire, that they might bury him in a tomb that would express that, and that he would rise into an Antichrist figure, as Isaiah 14 clearly tells us approximately 3 times in that verbiage in Isaiah 14, that this is not a man that will come back as, or it's not a man on the planet right now. It's a man that will die and then resurrect into an Antichrist on a sixth trumpet event as we move forward, possibly in the next few weeks, because it looks to me like Turkey's getting ready to walk into this war and cause havoc in the Middle East. Antichrist would reign once he's resurrected. This dead Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 would resurrect, turn into an Antichrist. He would reign for 1260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. You can see this in multiple verses, like Daniel 7 verse 25, Daniel 12 verse 7, Revelation 12 verse 14, Revelation 11 verse 2, Revelation 13 verse 5, Revelation 11 verse 3, and Revelation 12 verse 6 talks about how Antichrist will reign for approximately 3.5 year period of time. So I think if you use this theory above, you're going to see that this quatrain lines up. All 4 of these components are reflecting a death of a leader resurrecting into an Antichrist figure, and I've been talking about that very specific thing for the time I've been out here, basically. So this Mobus is stated in this quatrain. And so what significance does Mobus possibly have to what Nostradamus was talking about, and how that might affect Erdogan today? If you go into how he states this, and I'm not going to say that, it appears in the original text that he had in the 16th century French, meaning Mobus will soon die. So whatever, whoever this leader is, will die and then come back as an Antichrist. Look, if you are Main Street now and you've read the Bible and you believe that it's a general leader today that's just already on the ground and will aspire to be an Antichrist figure, you need to go look at Revelation and Isaiah 14, which clearly tells you this is a individual that will die and then be brought back as a resurrected figure. And I know this is a supernatural type event, but everything that God does is supernatural. So we need to look at how this is going to occur. He talks about how he will die soon. So if you look at Mobus, it is widely interpreted in the name or anagram of the third Antichrist. He is a figure whose death is said to trigger a global apocalypse or devastating world war. I've talked about how, based on reports of April 12, 2026, Erdogan intensified rhetoric against Israel, suggesting in a speech that Turkey could intervene militarily in the conflict, similar to past acts in Libya, Nagorno. These threats were part of an escalating war of words where Erdogan accused Israel's leadership of being blinded by blood and hatred over situation in Lebanon and Palestine, because they've been complaining about the Gaza war. Turkey, Erdogan believes that Hamas is not a terrorist group and that they're a legitimate government and should be recognized as such. Similar rhetoric was previously recorded in July of 2024. Erdogan's been threatening Israel for some time, especially after the October 2023 attack. He's come out strongly in condemnation against Israel as they've gone down and did this invasion into Palestine, and we've had all this carnage down in this area. So Erdogan suggested Turkey could enter Israel to stop actions against Palestine, according to this FDD analysis. It indicates that a horrible undoing of people and animals in his quatrain, at once one will see vengeance. I talked about how possibly if he dies and is resurrected, then of course he would be vengeful against the people that did this. He is an Antichrist, he is anti-God, and so we need to understand that the Lord Jesus, if he's breaking seals at this moment in time, has the deed to this world and is going to regain the control over this planet, which Satan controls at this time. It also talks about how 100 powers, not sure exactly what that means, but it does talk about how it could be alluding to the seals and all the different effects that are happening on the ground, because you have thirst, famine, and global unrest on the planet, as well as you have this comet passing at the same time. And that matters because there is a very specific comet, two actually comets that are passing at this moment in time close to the Earth. If you go into this horrible undoing of people and animals, at once one will see vengeance, thirst, famine, and a comet will pass. All this is sort of lining up with the global environment that we have out here today. Like I've talked about, how Erdogan could be this first seal or white horseman of Revelation that brings the next three seals to bear, seal 2, 3, and 4 upon the earth, and that this would open up a entrance into an Antichrist figure. So when you get into Revelation 6, verse 3 through 8, after we see the appearance of this white horseman or first seal, which I believe is Erdogan, that brings a quarter of the world into war, you open the second seal. It talks about how we have a red horse, great sword in his hand, that takes peace from the earth and also has the ability for man to kill each other. When you get into the third seal, it talks about a black horseman and how he has a pair of balances in his hand, and how he's going to affect the economics of the world, and how food shortages, famine, hyperinflation, stagflation would affect the world, and how we would see oil not being affected. So, and look at now, in the sense that oil's not being affected because there's a lot of it, but possibly we can't really use it, is an interesting concept that we're going through right now. This shutting down of the Strait of Hormuz, and also the effect of the Red Sea, even potentially the effect of the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, all in that area, are going to affect food shortages, things like that, commodity, broken supply chains, things like that. But yet there's a lot of oil out here. We just can't use it. So it's interesting that this seems to be affecting us at this moment. When you get to the fourth seal, he talks about how this pale horse with death sitting upon him, and I think it's interesting in this terminology, how he states it in this verse, that hell follows with him. So hell is following death on this horse, which could be potentially the bottomless pit is following this white horse rider to his death for a resurrectional effect that you would see, that we sort of indicate in the verses of Isaiah 14, that this is a resurrectional event from a dead Gog into an Antichrist type figure. So this pale horse with death sits on him, and hell follows him and gives him a power over a quarter of the earth to kill by sword, with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Now, interestingly, in the last portion of this quatrain, it talks about a comet that would pass about this time, and we're watching the rhetoric of Turkey and how they possibly could break out at any moment of this time. At the time is interesting timing. So in this month of April of 2026, two comets are expected to go by, and both of these are notable. So you have the C2026, which peaks around April 4th, although it may break apart due to the closeness of its solar pass. We also have the C2025, which is expected to offer the best viewing point in mid to late April 2026, particularly around the closest approach on or around April 27th. So when you look at this, you have the best visibility around April 17th, which is interesting because that is the start of the new Jewish month of Iyar. You're in Nisan right now, you're moving into Iyar. You always work off these calendar cycles, but it's interesting that this would also land around that date of Hitler's birthday. Between these two dates of April 17th and April 27th, we have Hitler's birthday of April 20th, and so this is extremely important that possibly something interesting could happen on or around this April 20th date. I also think that it's interesting that Nostradamus would bring up these three antichrists, Napoleon and Hitler, Hitler being the second one in his timing and his birth date. So Hitler's birth date was April 20th of 1889, and so 140 years between April 20th of 1889 and April 20th of 2029. You have 140 years. I'm not sure that equates to anything in general. If you think of anything, please let me know in the comments. I do think, though, it's interesting that if you take the date of Shemini Atzeret of October 1st of 2029, now follow me here a little bit. This is extremely important. I'll have to set this up and explain it as we're moving forward. But the Shemini Atzeret of October 1st of 2029 is what they call the 8th day, or the Great Assembly. This date would then be at the very end of the Shemitah cycle. It's the day right after the Feast of Tabernacles, which would complete the fall feast. If you take this date, which I think is interesting because you're going into the year 2030 on the Jewish calendars, I think it's interesting that if you subtract the 1260 days of Antichrist, if this possibly could lead us back to April 20th of 2026, if you subtract 1260 days from October 1st of 2029, which is the last possible day in the fall feast ceremonies, that this would take you to April 20th of 2026, which is Hitler's birthday, which could possibly be the entrance of a Antichrist figure or the start of an Antichrist phase, I guess I would say. The other thing I think is extremely important, if you look at the Hamas attack on October 7th of 2023, which occurred on Shemini Atzeret, this Shemini Atzeret seems to be a major time in the Jewish calendar, has affected them over history and seems to be affecting them in the future at the same time. So it's interesting that if you look at that Hamas attack on October 7, 2023 and project it forward to October 1st of 2029, that would be 6 completed years exactly between these two dates. That's interesting because if you have 6 completed years, that might lead you into the 7th year or the millennial cycle or the 7th year, which is the 1,000 years of the millennial, which would be then the rapture of the church on the Feast of Trumpets of September 10th of 2029. Because I believe that rapture is a pre-wrath or prior to 7 bowl phase, in my opinion. And so God tells us in the Bible we're not appointed for the wrath of God, which happens in Revelation 15:1, which starts the bowl phase of the 7 bowls of Revelation. So let's go back and look at why Shemini Atzeret, which seems to matter to this equation in the biblical calendars, why this seems to matter as we move forward. There seems to be a recurring theme here. So on Shemini Atzeret of October 7, 2023, we saw the Hamas attack. Then the day after, Hezbollah enters this conflict. And on October 1st, Iran and Hezbollah did a joint massive missile attack on Israel, expanding the Middle East conflict. Then on October 24th, on Shemini Atzeret, we had a significant military escalation and humanitarian crisis as multiple fronts involving Israel start to move forward, specifically in Gaza and Lebanon. So we're seeing these expansionary fronts. And then as you move from this October 24th, 2024 date of Shemini Atzeret, a year later on October 14th, 2025, we see a U.S. brokered ceasefire deal in Gaza facing significant challenges, including a report of Israel forces killing at least 5 to 9 Palestinians trying to return to northern Gaza. This marked a major violation in the ceasefire and different things, and so concurrently Hamas began handing over bodies of hostages under pressure through Donald Trump and threatening to intervene in the Hamas war. And so it's interesting that we saw this exchange start to occur on Shemini Atzeret of hostages through this pressure of Donald Trump on October 14th, 2025 on Shemini Atzeret. And so the question then would be, are we going to see possibly something happen this year on Shemini Atzeret, which would happen around October of 2026? Could we see in the near future, as we move forward in the next few weeks, could we see Erdogan of Turkey enter the Middle East conflict in a window between April 16th, which we've already started to go through during these potential areas of this comet that are going through, and April 26th of 2026, possibly around this April 20th, 2026 date of Hitler's birthday. It would stem from an expansion of Israel into Lebanon against Hezbollah as Turkish-backed Syrian forces also are ending the conflict against Hezbollah to the east on the Lebanese border. So this sort of goes through this first quatrain and how all of these different markers seem to be affecting us right now. We potentially would see Erdogan enter the conflict. He potentially would die shortly after that. He would rise as an Antichrist. He would bring pain upon animals and people. It would be due to vengeance of the original death of Erdogan being resurrected. With this, he would bring a lot of powers to him, possibly impregnated through Satan, and then would bring thirst, famine, and all kinds of consequences to the planet. And also at this very moment in time, we would see this comet pass. I've talked about how we would actually see a comet pass between this period of time as Erdogan is threatening to invade Israel at this moment. We talked about how Hitler's birthday falls in this period of time on October 20th of 2026, how Shemini Atzeret affects possibly this first quatrain, and how Erdogan or Turkey possibly could enter this battle between now and April 27th with a high peak period of April 20th of 2026 on Hitler's birthday. So let's go look at the second and the fourth quatrain. I've added these together because I believe they work in tandem, and there's an interesting indication of a 27-year war, which would lead us back to potentially Erdogan again. So let's look at the second quatrain. It states the Antichrist very soon annihilates three. So he's talking about possibly three countries. 27 years his war will last. The unbelievers are dead, captive, exiled, with blood, human bodies, water, and red hail. Interesting terminology that we'll get into, covering the earth. So it talks about how in this 27-year period of time, he would annihilate three potential countries. This war would last a total of 27 years, or a gap of time. And how I believe that if you look at the second and fourth quatrain that I have on this text file, it determines a time right now. In quatrain 4, it indicates a year of 1999 in the 7th month, as you'll see here, and how this might direct us to an event that could occur or affect Erdogan and compelled him actually into power. So we're going to take these two together. Like I say, it talks about how Antichrist annihilates three, there's 27-year war, you have all this carnage. But then when you get down into the fourth quatrain, it talks about how it's a year 1999, which would affect us now in the 7th month. And from the sky would come a great king of terror to bring back to life the king of the Mongols before and after Mars to reign by good luck. Now, I know there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm going to try to do the best I can. There was a number of events that happened in the past and are getting ready to happen that are affecting this quatrain he's talking about at this moment in time. It's amazing the accuracy that Nostradamus had in these quatrains, and how in the 1600s he could actually predict what could potentially happen as we move forward through three antichrists in the future is extremely interesting. So look at this major event that happened on August 17th of 1999. You had this massive earthquake that literally changed the path of Erdogan at that time. Because of this earthquake and the state's failure to manage it, it brought Erdogan into power, and he was elected into office shortly after that. So on October 17th of 1999, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck this region near Istanbul, killing over 17,000 people. It brought the state into paralysis, which then basically brought Erdogan into power. It exposed the corruption in the government. The disaster revealed this widespread corruption, specifically amnesty given to substandard construction that caused modern buildings to crumble, causing 17,000 people to die, building a public rage against this condemnation against this government. And at the same time, listen to this. This is crazy how this happened. Erdogan was imprisoned at the time during the quake. Erdogan was serving a prison sentence between March and July of 1999, and at this moment in time of July 1999, in the 7th month in 1999, Erdogan recites a religious poem sending a message to Allah or whoever. Perceiving his victimization by the state, combining with the state's failure during the quake, boosted his status as an anti-establishment hero, bringing him into power in 2002 when he was elected in as prime minister, then into president, and is the president of Turkey today. So he's been in potential power since 1999 once this earthquake hit. Interestingly, Nostradamus potentially saw this earthquake in his Quatrain visions, and he indicated how this would bring back a terrible leader, probably like an Antichrist, sort of like the Mongols' leader, Genghis Khan, which we'll get into a little bit, and how Mars might affect us at that moment in time now. And so when you get into this, you'll realize that Mars is affecting us right now. Now, interestingly, as you get into this quatrain, Mars is known as the red planet due to its oxide rust looking color on the surface of this reddish blood-like color on the surface of the planet, leading ancient civilizations associated with war and destruction. The Romans named the planet after Mars, their god. It symbolized a circle with an arrow pointing out, representing a shield and a spear. In April of 2026, Mars is a key player in a rare morning planet parade. So we actually have this planetary parade happening right now in April, appearing at the eastern sky along Saturn, Mercury, and Neptune. So you got Mars, Saturn, Mercury, and Neptune all in a planetary parade. The planets will be closest around April 18th to the 20th. So you have this massive convergence appearing in a tight formation within a constellation of Aquarius or Pisces, with Mars specifically transitioning into Aries on April 9th to heighten its energy, whatever that means. Now, I'm not getting into this type of science, but I do believe that the Bible tells us and God tells us that we should understand how these solar eclipses, blood moons, and different things affected us. And also, if you go back into the prophets, they needed to use these different markers so that they could understand what was going on in their time. So we have this planetary parade between April 15th and 20th. At the same time, you have the two comets going through. It affects Mars, Saturn, Mercury, forming a visible alignment in the eastern pre-dawn sky, with Neptune nearby, also requiring a telescope to see this. Interesting, at the end of this, you have Hitler's birthday, and you have a peak alignment on April 18th. You go into April 17th, into that eve, into April 18th, you go into the new Jewish month of Iyar. 4 planets appear clustered within a 10-degree span low on the eastern horizon, roughly 30 to 60 minutes before sunrise. You should be able to see this. The Romans named this Mars from their god of war, while the Babylonians linked it to Nergal, I may be saying that wrong, their deity of destruction. The symbolic association persists today. King Nebuchadnezzar was Babylonian. Okay, so this might matter to also Daniel 2, the statue of head of gold. So if you go back to Daniel 2, you realize that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, and so this is really matters to the Daniel 8 prophecy, because if you look at the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, so if you look at this chart and you go back into the history of the Jews, and this is a history lesson, guys. I mean, you can look this up and find out the history of the Jews. They've been under some captivity or slavery or some kind of tyranny for 7 kingdoms, starting with the Egyptians, going through the Assyrians, through the Babylonians, Medo-Persians, the Greeks, Macedonian Empire, then you have the Roman Empire, and then after the Roman Empire, and we're going to address some of this as we move forward in the text file, you go into the Ottoman Empire. A lot of believe that this is a revived Roman Empire, but if you go into the history, the 7th kingdom that has placed the Jews under some type of tyranny or slavery or whatever was the Ottomans, which then was dissolved in World War I, at the end of World War I. This 7th kingdom, as the Bible indicates, would turn into an 8th kingdom or a beast kingdom based on these kingdoms of Nebuchadnezzar moving forward. Now, if you look at Daniel in totality, this is a history lesson getting ready to play out in the future, and he told Daniel he wouldn't understand this, that they would be similar kingdoms in the future that reflected the kingdom of the Babylonians and these 3 kingdoms that would move forward. So you'd have a history lesson that would play out in the future. If you take the kingdoms that he gives us, the head of gold, which is the Neo-Babylonian, which actually represented Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom itself, this breast, arms, and silver, which are the Medo-Persians or the Kurds, Iranians that we just talked about earlier, that's affecting us now. And also this Greco-Macedonian Empire, which is the belly and thighs of bronze, which would represent Turkey, that if you took these 3 kingdoms and applied them to Daniel 7 verse 4, 7 verse 5, and 7 verse 6, this area or these 3 kingdoms would make up an Antichrist beast system footprint in the future. So I've done a video on this breakdown of the 12 chapters of Daniel to give you an idea of the footprint of the beast kingdom, because he gives you a very good understanding of this, especially in chapter 4, 5, and 6, where you have Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, Belshazzar's kingdom after that, and Darius the Mede's kingdom in chapter 6. Why this matters is because if you overlay these 3 kingdoms into their land areas, that turns into a potential beast system at the end, as he indicates in the Bible. In the past, this was Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. today it would represent potentially Saddam Hussein and Iraq, which fell just recently. Then you're moving into where we are right now in time, which is the bear with the one side raised up and the 3 ribs in his mouth in Daniel 7:5, which would represent Darius and Cyrus, or the Medo-Persians, which are the Kurds in Iran of today possibly. That shows you their footprint. Then you get into this last or third kingdom, which is the Greco-Macedonian Empire, which would be basically Turkey or Alexander the Great, and how that would then move you into another footprint. And if you overlay these 3 footprints on top of each other, you'll realize that this basically is the Ottoman footprint in the 4th map here. This is extremely important because when you go to the feet of iron and clay, which represents the Ottoman empire of today, which is affecting us as we move forward into the next 3.5 years, this would be your beast kingdom that he's talking about as we move forward. And you see this 10-nation group of radicalized Muslims form and actually start to move against an attack on Israel. So I think it's interesting that he's talking about this 1999 7th month. It talks about that earthquake and how Erdogan was brought into power due to this economic calamity of this earthquake on his economy, and this was structural within the government, compelled him into power. We see Mars affecting us at this moment in time. This has to do with a potential Babylonian link, which would then bring you back to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom of the head of gold in Daniel 2. You can also then transfer that into Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 as you look at the 4 beasts that he talks about in chapter 7 especially. Erdogan and Turkey possibly will enter this conflict during this period of time, during this cosmic event, possibly around the 20th of April, which would be Hitler's birthday. Could he be possibly worse than Genghis Khan that lived approximately 300 years prior to the time of Nostradamus? And so he would have known who Genghis Khan was and how bad of an individual Genghis Khan was, and how many millions of people he affected or killed. And so is he alluding to possibly this rise of this leader in 1999 in July? You could even possibly apply this to the Jewish calendars, but its 7th month would not necessarily fall in July. So I don't think it's a Jewish calendar thing, because the 7th month would be in October or September. And if you actually go into the conception of the Gregorian calendar, I believe it came in 1582, which would be about the same time Nostradamus was on the ground. So I do believe he was alluding to, in this case, a Gregorian month of July in 1999, which is the same time that Erdogan was being affected by this earthquake, and now we're being affected today by a potential invasion by Turkey as we move forward. But if you go back to when Erdogan came into power, now he was compelled into power at the beginning of 1999 in July, but he gained power actually when he became the prime minister of Turkey in 2002, when he had the election. He has profoundly affected 3 areas of the Middle East. He's affected a lot of things. He's been genociding the Armenians. He's sort of overtaken Azerbaijan and controls a lot of that through defensive pacts. He's affected Syria, that 12-day war in 2024 in December, November, December. or through Syrian forces that were Turkey proxies. So that was a 12-day war. He controls that whole area. He's affected Libya through civil war and intervention. He's also affected Iraq through the Kurds, and he set up also, like I said, in 2019, he set up a 30-kilometer or 20-mile buffer zone in Syria and Iraq. So all these areas are being affected by Erdogan. He's going to affect other countries. But in this 27-year war between 2002 and the end of the Shemitah cycle in 2029, you have a 27-year gap of time. And so he's talking about how he's going to affect three, potentially in the past, Syria, Libya, Iraq, as he's consuming all these different areas. He's also affecting Greece, Africa, Afghanistan. He's all over the place. You're having this potential quatrain literally affecting us at this moment in time. So Antichrist annihilates 27 years. He has this war lasting between 2002 and 2029 because he's not done yet. The unbelievers are dead, captive, exiled with blood, human bodies. And then look at the last portion of this. Water and red hail covering the earth. So we're going to cover that next because I think this is extremely important as we move forward. So we're seeing Erdogan affect people for almost 3 decades, at least over 2 decades, but almost 3 decades. And so he's affecting all these different countries and all these different areas in the Middle East. He's been expanding. No one's really ever done anything about it. They've never really contested him. He's been genociding the Armenians. He's been genociding the Kurds. But yet he then complains about Israel genociding the Palestinians and the Lebanese and different things like that. So, you know, it is what it is. But then he talks about this really interesting verbiage here: water and hail, red hail covering the earth. I believe this is extremely important timing, especially when you get into Revelation in the verses that I'm going to explain as we move forward, because it talks about how a specific event would happen in the Bible in Revelation prior to the arrival or entrance of an Antichrist figure. So in Revelation 8, which is the whole chapter, verse 1 through 13, explains this potential understanding of this water and red hail covering the earth. So when we look at Revelation 8, and especially Revelation 8 verse 1 and 2, there's a procession of events that I think people need to understand so they can get their chronological order of the 22 chapters of Revelation figured out properly. It states some really interesting things here because it talks about how he opens the seventh seal. You get a half an hour of silence, or approximately a half an hour of silence, and then 7 angels that stood before God were given 7 trumpets, and then they go forward and blow them. So he's giving you extremely important information here, and some people will put like the first seal, first trumpet, first bowl overlapped. That's not how this works based on Revelation 8 verse 1 and 2, because he says he opens the 7th seal, about a half an hour of silence, then he hands out 7 trumpets, and then they go forward to blow. So you have to understand your 7 seals happen first. That's when your 6th seal war occurs. leading you into a trumpet phase. Then you have some trumpets after the 7 seals, which takes you into a 6th trumpet Antichrist phase, into a bowl phase or a wrath phase at the end, which are the 7 bowls of God's wrath in Revelation 15:1, which we are not appointed for because you're raptured just prior to that. So look at the timing here. He's talking about a seals war prior to this, okay? Talked about how Erdogan's the white horseman would die on a 6th seal event. The 10 nations would be destroyed. Iran is absorbed prior to that, so Daniel 8 completes. Then you have Ezekiel 38:39. The 10 nations go against Israel. They're then destroyed by a 6th seal event, taking you to a 7th seal event. About a half an hour of silence, the selection of 144,000 elect or elite that God brings forward to battle against Antichrist as we go into this next trumpet phase. Right after the 7th seal and the selection of the 144,000, then he hands out the 7 trumpets, and the 7 angels will then go forward and blow them. And the first 4 seem to reflect this terminology in this part of the quatrain. So let's look at those 4 trumpets and how they're going to affect the planet and us as we move forward in the future. So he's given out these 7 trumpets. These angels start to blow them. Right before this, another angel came and stood at the altar having the golden censer. There were given unto him much incense, and he should offer it with prayers to all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And then he states that the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And then these next verses really pertain to what he's talking to about up here. The angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and cast it to the earth, and there were voices, thunderings, lightnings, and the earthquake. The 7 angels which had 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded, and there was followed hail and fire mingled with blood, that they were cast upon the earth, and 1/3 of the part of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. So he's stating in Nostradamus' Quatrain that during this Antichrist phase of his 27 years of war, possibly between 2002 and 2029, that we would see a potential entrance of Antichrist. Prior to that, because we're not at the 6th trumpet yet, we would see hail and red hail and water covering the earth. Now look at this, because this gets more detail as you move forward here. So he's talking about how you have this first angel that has hail and fire mingled with blood cast upon the earth, and 1/3 part of the trees are burned up, and all the green grass is burned up on 1/3 part of the planet. I've talked about this many times and how I believe that this is going to affect the communist areas, and they won't be a major factor as we move forward into the biblical process, because it's not a communist thing. It's a Jew, Muslim, Christian thing. So let's look at the next 3 trumpets and how they're going to also affect how he states this up here in this quatrain. The second angel, and as it were a great burning mountain. Now this is really intense, guys, so listen to what he has stating here. He's burning up 1/3 of the planet here in the first trumpet with this mingled blood, hail, and fire, okay, that he's casting upon the earth. Then he throws a fiery mountain, great mountain, burning with fire, cast into the sea. I talked about how it potentially could be in the Pacific Ocean, how it would cause this massive tsunami that would rush across that portion of the third of the planet and destroy it, destroying all the sea life, destroying all the ships, destroying the coastlines. This would affect all the communist areas around, China, Russia. It would affect Japan, North Korea. It would go down all the way down into that area, down into Australia. It would destroy Hawaii. It would affect our west coastline, affect parts of South America, probably Australia. I mean, it could be a 1,000-foot tsunami. We don't know what that's going to do. In the United States, if you had a massive tsunami hit the west coast, it would probably stop at the mountain range, but you would lose potentially a third of the country, based on what he's talking about here. A third of the ships are destroyed in the ocean. A third of the sea creatures are destroyed. Then in the third trumpet, he has a great star fall from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp, that falls on the third of the rivers and the fountains of the waters, and makes them bitter, undrinkable, and people die from thirst and poisoning of the waters themselves. And then the fourth angel sound, and a third part of the sun is smitten, a third part of the moon, a third part of the stars, so a third part of them were darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. And then one of my favorite verses in the Bible, which is the one I built the 117 step 4 by 8 foot chart on. One verse gives you basically a chronological breakdown of the book of Revelation, because once you realize that in this verse an angel is flying through mid-heaven and talks about how the three woes would infect the inhabitants of the earth, and that we would see three additional trumpets, which each have an additional attached woe, occur after this angel flies through and warns the earth that Antichrist is getting ready to appear and Satan is getting ready to be thrown out of heaven. So when you look at these three woes, he's talking about the fifth, sixth, and seventh trumpet. If you look at Revelation and you look at those three subvisions, you'll realize that you have reoccurring fifth, sixth, and seventh trumpets. Also reoccurring 1260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. They can only happen once in the top portion or the main storyline, but then in the subdivisions, the elect, nations, and people, and Mystery Babylon in chapter 7, 11, and through 14, 17 through 19, you're going to see reoccurring fifth, sixth, and seventh trumpet. If you go into Revelation and look at how they're set up chronologically, you'll realize that the fifth trumpet actually occurs in Revelation 9:1, the sixth trumpet occurs in Revelation 9:13, and the seventh trumpet would actually sound in Revelation 15:1, right as he starts to hand out the seven bowls of wrath. It talks about how you're seeing the seventh trumpet sound in Revelation 15:1, and you see a rapture event directly after that in Revelation 15 verse 2. So it's extremely important. So he's talking about how we're going to see, prior to an Antichrist phase, this water or flooding of the earth by possibly this massive mountain being thrown into the ocean, the star coming down, poisoning the waters, as well as red hail covering the earth as this angel gets this trumpet, starts to cast this blood hail mixture to the earth. And then we get a Antichrist phase shortly after that, after you see a devastation of the third of the planet going into this potential terrible last 3.5 years of the Shemitah cycle. So let's go to the third quatrain and see what he has to say in this and how this might affect the other quatrains above. So the third quatrain, Century 2, Quatrain 30, the reborn Hannibal. One whom the infernal gods of Hannibal will cause to be reborn, terror of mankind, never more horror nor worse days in the past than will come to the Roman through Babel. The way he states this is extremely important. He's talking about the worst possible time in history. God clearly tells you this will be the worst possible time in history combined in the last days or end days. It will be sevenfold evil, and it will be a reborn Roman Empire. A lot of people think this is a revised Roman Empire, but if you go into the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, you have the Roman Empire that turns into the Ottoman Empire as we move forward. We are going to go through that history, so you'll be able to see that here. It talks about this Hannibal guy, and this is extremely important because he talks about these deities of Baal and different Greek and Roman gods that might affect how, especially Mars, we had that Mars convergence with the planet parade going on. And so these it's amazing how the Romans and the Greeks all believed in the same gods in general. They just named them differently, and so you can see the different aspects of this. Just for your own information, I don't really get into the Greek and Roman thing, but it's important that we understand how they reflect the biblical nature of what we're studying at this moment in time. And so Hannibal was big into this. He's relating to potentially a Roman thing in the future through Babel, which is interesting because this all reflects where we are today. It also would reflect Turkey now. So if you look at the Roman Empire and the shift eastward to modern day Turkey, and its eventual division into the east and west of the gradual response to the massive administration of military pressure. So the Roman Empire collapsed over time. And so what happened is they moved from their position in Rome to Constantinople, Turkey, and then split into two divisions of the East and West divisions of the Roman Empire, which is reflective in the legs of iron in the statue of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2. So we had this split. We had the Roman Empire shift to Turkey. This brought in Constantine the Great in 330 AD, which then established a new capital, which is the Byzantines, which matters to the prophecy up here, talking about the Romans through Babel and the Byzantine type era through Nebuchadnezzar and the statue in Daniel 2. Like I say, the Roman Empire is visualized in the two legs of iron, which is the sixth kingdom, the Jewish suppression and slavery of history. The seventh kingdom, which would then come in shortly after that. If you look at the history of the Jews, it's not a revised Roman Empire. It's the Ottomans that controlled them for over 400 years between 1517 and 1917, which was the Ottoman era. And then you had the destruction of the Ottoman era through World War I and this major treaty through the Balfour Declaration, which then brought this support to a Jewish national home in Palestine. As Ottoman control failed, the British pledged support for Zionism, while simultaneously the Ottoman authority in April of 1917 forced thousands of Jews to evacuate Tel Aviv. So this is extremely important now that you have this Ottoman Empire. Now, the one thing I've been trying to explain in a number of videos is, look, if you're in the seventh kingdom of the Ottomans that supposedly ended in World War I, but yet is being revised by Erdogan today, and there's no kingdom between the seventh kingdom, which was the Ottomans, and the beast kingdom, which is the eighth kingdom. You're still in the Ottoman era right now, and Erdogan's getting ready to come forward as a Gog of Ezekiel 38-39, die in some destructive mode through the wrath of the Lamb in Revelation 6:16 on the sixth seal, because he's the white horseman of Revelation. He's going to die on the sixth seal and then rise as an Antichrist figure as we move forward into this last 3.5 years. So we've gone through these first 4 quatrains that seem to line up with now and how Turkey and Erdogan might affect us as we move forward into a beast system, as potentially Erdogan enters the Middle East conflict. Something would potentially happen to him, killing him, moving us into an Antichrist phase, a resurrection of a dead Erdogan into an Antichrist figure. And then we have a couple other additional quatrains that might actually feed into this narrative above that I will go into here quickly. So when you look at these additional quatrains that Nostradamus gives us about this third Antichrist, he comes up with this interesting visual of this blue turbaned leader arising from a Middle East nation, causing immense suffering in Europe and the Mediterranean, a figure frequently linked to a third Antichrist, or Mobus as he calls it. In many interpretations, this figure is seen to be a menace to the Mediterranean countries, including Turkey, a catalyst for a third world war, with some scholars mapping these threats against the modern geopolitical context of the Middle East and Turkey. So a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of these scholars believe that Nostradamus was leading you to a Muslim figure that followed Muhammad, wore a blue head or blue turban, and came from potentially the country, a Muslim country of Turkey itself. So when you go into the terminology or interpretation of the blue turban or blue head in Nostradamus study, the blue head or blue turban is interpreted as a symbol of a warrior from the East, specifically a leader emerging from a Muslim nation in the Middle East. Mobus is identified in Century 2, Quatrain 62. Mobus is considered the third Antichrist, frequently associated with a blue turban prophecy. The white head, Byzantine, we talked about the Byzantines above, interprets sometimes differently between a blue turban, and I'm going to go into these different colored turbans here in a minute, often considered an invading force, and the white turban, which some interpret as a spiritual leadership of a region, sometimes associated with traditional powers like Byzantine or modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. Great Arabia or Middle East, the origin of the leader is usually cited as a country of Greater Arabia, interpreted broadly as the Middle East, with some interpretation connecting it to Turkey, Iran, or Gulf states. Now, these are the relevant quatrains in English that affect this blue turban or this just additional quatrains that affect the 4 quatrains above, or I think are pertinent to this conversation, I should say. So while Nostradamus wrote in 16th century French, here are English translations of the quatrains frequently cited regarding these figures. So the third Antichrist blue turban, often cited from a 1981 film, The Man Who Saw Tomorrow, it states, out of the country of great Arabia shall be born a strong master of Muhammad. He will enter Europe wearing a blue turban. He will be a terror of mankind, never more horror. Now, I believe this is interesting because as you move forward here and we look at the color of the turbans, if you go into Turkey social circles, the blue turbans were worn by the Christians. So is he going to wear a blue turban to sway the Christian nations, to convert them to a Sharia law as he's moving through Europe? Not necessarily the United States, because we're isolated over here. He's going to affect Europe the most. He's trying to target the Christians and Jews to convert them to as an Islamic religion or Sharia type law into a beast system as we move forward. So I think it's an extremely interesting how he states this. We've talked about this one already, how Mavis would die soon, how Erdogan potentially would die after he starts attacking Israel with the 10 nations, and then he would rise again as an Antichrist figure through a resurrection, bringing destruction against people and beasts, sudden vengeance against this death of him, bringing in the seals and all this destruction through the seals war into an Antichrist phase. As you see the trumpets hit, devastating a third of the planet. Right before an entrance of an Antichrist, we would see potentially this comet coming through, which we start to see right now is happening in April. It talks about in this blue and white turban quatrain, Century 5, Quatrain 27, by fire force the blue turban king will enter Phoenix. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but what he states next, I do believe, is extremely important, because he says he will reign less than an evolution of Saturn. If you look at an evolution of Saturn around the sun, it's approximately 29.45 years, which is interesting because he talks about this 27-year war that Erdogan would bring upon the Middle East between potentially 2002 and 2029. And that he would reign less than an evolution of Saturn, which is 29.45 years, so you're talking 27 years. And that the white turban king, Byzantine heart banished, look at this, Sun, Mars, Mercury near Aquarius. Okay, we just talked about all of these different connections of Mars, Mercury, Aquarius, and how this would be a Byzantine king through Nebuchadnezzar, mimicking Nebuchadnezzar through potentially Turkey and Erdogan. As you see, all these different aspects are occurring at this moment in time. And he brings up this Byzantine, which is really interesting, so I think it's really interesting the way he states this. He's wearing a white turban, but then he ends up with a blue turban. So if you think about the turbans that we're going to show you as we move forward here, and I am getting to that, the white turbans are worn by the Muslims. The blue turbans are worn by the Christians in the Muslim law. And so he's a Muslim leader that will then wear a blue turban to try to convert the Christians and the Jews into a Sharia or a Muslim type system. He's alluding to the Byzantines, or the era of Turkey. As you move forward up in here, you can see he's talking about the Byzantine type area of Constantinople the Great, which was the Romans that ended up disintegrating over time, moving to Constantinople, Turkey, which then brought in Constantinople himself, then perverting the religion of the Christians into a replacement theology. And I know some of you won't agree with that, but that's exactly what's happening there. So this is happening. He's alluding to this shift into Turkey, that the Antichrist would come from Turkey, that you have this period of 29.45 years, or this 27-year war that we've been talking about in his prophecy, that you would have a planet parade occurring between April 15th and 20th involving Mars, Saturn, and Mercury. And he talks about the Sun, Mars, and Mercury near Aquarius, which is interesting because if you go into the constellation Aquarius is positioned in the eastern sky just before sunrise between April 15th and 20th of 2026. During this period, it serves as a backdrop for the notable gathering of planets. You have the planet parade, specifically Mars and Saturn, which are emerging from the sun's glare. It's crazy how all this is lining up, and you can just speculate all you want all day long, but there's too many connections to make me think that there's not something happening potentially on the April 20th date, which is Hitler's birthday. So let's go into these Ottoman turban colors and why that might matter to this new Antichrist figure as he moves forward into the future. So when you're looking at his quatrains and you realize he's talking about a white and blue turban, then that takes you directly to Turkey, which then comes up with these Ottoman turban colors, which are strictly regulated by law to differentiate between the classes, religions, and occupations in the country, with headwear serving a critical indicator of social status until the 19th century reforms. So the Ottoman court often used visual language of colors to instantly identify an individual's background. So they, is what it is. Historical turban colors associated with classes, and this is pre-1826. So a green reserved exclusively for those from the Prophet Muhammad's lineage. So if you had a green turban, you were special. If you wore a white turban, they were worn by the Muslims who were not of the Prophet's family, including sultan, judges, and government officials. High-ranking officials wore massive white turbans, which were often fashioned from burial shrouds to serve as a reminder of mortality. The blue was a Christian turban. They were forced to wear these so that they could determine which ones were Christians over the Muslims. In my opinion, the Antichrist might wear a blue turban in the end days, to, as it indicates in the quatrain, he wears a blue turban and moves through Europe because he's probably not going to get to the United States, but he's going to affect the European nations. He would put a blue turban on to try to induce the Christian nations to come to his side of the equation, I guess, and be converted into the Muslim religion or ideology. So he's going to sway these or convert these Christians and Jews into a beast system or a caliphate, or a 7-year treaty that's broken through the halfway mark in Daniel 9:27. This would then affect also the European Christians and countries also. The yellow turban was represented by the Jewish population. Black was primarily different, I can't even say that word, different groups wore the black. So you have all these different groups. Even they had a red turban for the Moldavian type groups. So all these different groups were segregated into these color schemes so they could easily be identified, with 2 of them being extremely important in Nostradamus's prophecies or quatrains about a white and blue turbaned individual coming potentially out of Turkey. And you can, like I say, see these different colors and how they affect the different groups. Contextual connections to Turkey. So you've got the Byzantinism that's in these quatrains that talks about the white and the blue turban, and how this blue turban might be an invader into a Christian type nation throughout Europe, and how this might come from Turkey and affect them. That there is a 27-year war process in this, which I've talked about how Erdogan came in through that 1999 earthquake, compelled him into the prime minister due to the terrible response of the earthquake. He then got into the prime minister in 2002, then compelled him into office, into the presidency, I believe in 2014. He's been there ever since, and this has been basically a 27-year process. He also, like I said above here, indicates how this would be less than 29.45 years, and so this is the case. It would be only 27 years. And the third adversary, the blue turban, is one of 3 major destructive figures prophesied along Napoleon and Hitler, with many commentaries expecting this threat to manifest in a modern era as a violent Islamic fundamentalist leader, potentially Erdogan of Turkey. So I hope you got some really good information out of here, some really cool connections that lead us to now. Amazingly, this man in the 1500s saw potentially the future, how accurate he possibly is in his quatrains. Now, I've been intrigued with Nostradamus for a few decades at this point, because I believe that if he could predict these 2 original antichrists, potentially he could predict a 3rd antichrist. A lot of scholars do believe that they can pinpoint his original 2 antichrists through his quatrains down to the point where, they're very plausible. So can we then isolate down the 3rd antichrist with what information he gives you? And I believe that we can. And I believe it's now, and I believe that you should be looking to Turkey and Erdogan to fulfill these prophecies. So we'll see how all that turns out. Everything could break after April 20th. You are at the 1260-day mark, at the last possible day in the Shemitah cycle that you could be at, which takes you to Shemini Atzeret of October 1st of 2029, which would be the last day of the Feast of, or the day right after the Feast of Tabernacles, which would then complete the marriage cycle, leading you into the millennial phase. And so it's a real possibility that that's exactly where you are right now. Can I guarantee it? No. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm just trying to show you the connections based on the analytic information that I've been presenting to you, and you have to make your own determinations. I'm not dogmatic. I know a lot of people think based on how I do my videos I'm dogmatic. I seem to get this error that I'm dogmatic in some way. I'm passionate about how I present my stuff. Maybe a lot of people don't like that, but I believe I bring a lot of good content. So if you can get past that, and I do believe the Paradigm 2030 chart and information and the date stamps that it provides, and you can see the majority of what is going on right now in that last video, which brings you to where we are right now. So it would work in tandem with this video also, because you're talking about now. There's a lot to that, and that these date stamps do seem to be coming true. You got a date stamp of May 19th and June 24th coming up, I believe. So you need to be paying attention to these dates, as I believe you have a ceasefire that's getting ready to collapse in front of you. If it does, and this war amplifies, which seems to be what the Bible is telling us is going to happen, and so I'm going to trust them and not the white noise and the narrative out here and the confusion of the dialogue that's going on between Iran and the United States, Israel, and all the others, that we should focus on the truth, and that's what's in the Bible, and the Bible will give us the answers. And so I always go to the Bible and to the Paradigm 2030 chart to give me what's coming next. And so I believe that Nostradamus also, in his own way, had the ability through the Bible and his understanding of astrological events and things that he saw through his abilities to see what was coming to the end of time and how that was going to affect us, actually to the point where he give you a 27-year war gap of time between 2002 and 2029, and a specific year and day of or specific year and month of an event that would bring forth a terrible leader or king similar to Genghis Khan that would bring terror upon the world and bring back this Antichrist third figure around the time of this astrological parade that affects Mars, which then represents war. And I believe that's where you are right now. So if this war does resume and it does not de-escalate, my guess is the pump prices will go through the roof, and if you probably should be filling your tank this weekend before Monday and the ceasefire then falls apart and we see an escalation. This could affect Turkey, especially if you have an attack by Israel and the United States into Iran, and then Iran would then retaliate, potentially sending more missiles into Turkish airspace. That would then bring them into the war. They have that potential of creating a buffer zone in Iran, as they did in Syria and Iraq, where they put those 20-kilometer buffer or 30-kilometer buffer zones in, which are about 20 miles. They would then put a third one in Iran because they border that country, and they would want to have the ability to knock the missiles down before they get into the Black Sea, hit their ships, or into their pipeline in the eastern part of Turkey, or actually penetrate into the country. Israel is expanding into Lebanon, even though they have a ceasefire sort of in place right now. Those tend to fall apart fairly quickly, and Hezbollah is not going away until they eliminate that threat or eliminate Iran. If you look at the process in the Bible and how I've talked about this, this is going to affect Lebanon then Gaza, Egypt, end up with the destruction of Iran, then allowing Persia to be brought into Ezekiel 38-39 and the completion of Daniel 8 with 10 nations ending up on Israel's doorstep. That would then create a sixth seal event, breaking a sixth seal, killing a leader of Turkey, burying him, resurrecting him into an Antichrist figure as we move forward into the next 3.5 years. We'll just have to see how that all occurs, but that is supposedly what the Bible is telling us is going to occur, and we have to figure out how that is going to affect us as we move forward into potentially this date of April 20th of 2026. Extremely important date. And possibly he's going to bring him back on the birth, whatever this Antichrist figure, the start of this Antichrist phase on April 20th, on Hitler's birthday, which reflected the second Antichrist of Nostradamus's predictions. And so I think all these things do matter to where we're heading. So please go out and get your supplies ready, because if this does fall apart on Monday, the prices of everything is going to go up drastically. Fuel, you may have supply chains that are broken, so certain items that you need may or not be able to be found, or they'll be at an exorbitant price that you can't afford. Buying supplies, food, and things right now is an investment, because that inflation is going to catch up with you, and those products are going to be double what they were if you were to buy them now. If you had purchased your items in the last few years, they would be about half the price they are now. And these items will, their shelf life is more than 5 years, probably longer than we're going to be here through this potential rapture period. I believe that's going to happen on the Feast of Trumpets of 2029, which would be around September 10th. That you'll be able to get through this, but the food prices could skyrocket once this breaks, and so all these things need to be thought about when things are starting to get extremely expensive and tight on the budget already, as we're starting to see food prices, fuel prices, and other things that matter to us escalate. So just do what's necessary. A lot of these products could not be possibly found on the shelves as you start to see these supply chains broken. Food is going to become harder and harder to get because they're having issues with fuel and price of fertilizer. If you take that into consideration, you then realize that if they're not using as much fertilizer, or the cost of fertilizer is high, one of two things are going to occur. You're not going to get as much yield, and it's going to be expensive or more expensive. That could then cause shortages across the globe and more famine and things like you see indicated in the fourth seal. If you're getting ready to go into an Antichrist phase where you have a destruction of Gog, you're almost into the sixth seal event now. You're possibly getting ready to watch the martyrs under the altar ask why he hasn't done something about this. And possibly that's exactly where you are at this moment in time. You're at the fifth seal getting ready for the sixth seal to break, which is going to affect massive amounts of people as you go through a sixth seal destructive earthquake and other effects into 4 trumpets devastating a third of the planet, into a bottomless pit opening on a 5th trumpet, and a Antichrist false prophet coming forward on a 6th trumpet for 3.5 years of control over this planet. It's extremely important that you can't be part of that system. You cannot Let me reiterate this. You cannot be part of the beast system. You cannot take that mark. If you do, you'll forfeit your soul forever. It's just that plain and simple. He states it. It's unforgivable sin to take the mark of the beast. You will never be able to recover from this. So God bless you. We'll see what happens on April 20th. Maybe nothing at all. Could be the start of a cycle of total destruction. We'll just have to see as we move forward. Just be safe out there. Get your supplies, your oil ready. If you have everything ready, you can sit back and sort of see how this all plays out. That investment will pay off as you move forward, because the supply disruptions and things like that are not going to go anyway soon. A lot of the refineries are going to take time to fix. Oil disruptions aren't going to happen and be fixed overnight, and so this is a lag effect to what's getting ready to happen and how that's going to affect you as you move forward. So God bless, be safe out there, and have a great night.